welcome to the AI panel today. I know we had a lot of discussion on crypto and sort of where the space is headed. I think now we bring in a couple different experts across different fields, across legal, across investments, across foundation level, and also across go-to-market. So we'd like for everyone to kind of introduce themselves and kind of what kind of got you into sort of this AI agent space.
Sure, thank you. Happy to be here. My name is Christian Crowley. I'm a partner on the go-to-market team at A16Z Crypto. I help our portfolio companies with a range of different things around go-to-market. My background is largely in crypto. I've been building in the space for about 10 years. I founded a company in the interface layer for DeFi, but most recently I've actually been building an AI. I built a local AI application that lets you run open source language models locally on your laptop offline. So this intersection between crypto and AI is pretty near and dear to my heart. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm Abhishek Vaidyanathan. Thanks for having me on this panel. I'm Chief Legal Officer at Near, and really at Near we're building right at this intersection in two different ways. The first is through Near Intents, which is started really as a cross-chain transaction layer, and I think we're going to talk about AI agents being the biggest on-chain actors, and that the start of this is really cross-chain swaps, but I think expanding to a number of different types of transactions, and really an intent is just simply a way to get something done that you want, right? So that was the vision for intents. And then on the AI side, we've been building a number of sort of different products and offerings. The core one being Ironclaw, which is a secure agent harness that uses private confidential AI to maintain your secrets. If you're going to use AI agents to transact using banking accounts or even giving API keys, to be able to do that in a more secure way without having those secrets exfiltrated. And so, this topic is near and dear to my heart, and excited to dive more into it.
All right. Hi, I'm Travis Scher, co-founder and managing partner of a firm called North Island Ventures. We do both early stage investing and public markets investing, primarily in crypto. I think agentic finance broadly is a category that we're very bullish on, so excited to be here.
Good afternoon, Johnny Garcia. I lead institutional growth and capital markets efforts at the VeChain Foundation. The VeChain Foundation has been around roughly, I guess, mainnet since 2017, but 2 years before that, we've been operating in this space building. Can you hear me just fine? Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry. That's awesome. Building a number of things. So we run the gamut from enterprise-based applications vis-a-vis blockchain as a service, all the way to consumer-based applications that are launched on chain. And as of recent, we've just launched vworld.ai, which is essentially an ecosystem that removes the barriers for creators to both build, launch agents, and then also be able to exchange commercially on chain.
All right. And I'm David. I'm running Inception Capital. I was previously leading global strategy and investments at Huobi for 4 years before launching Inception, which is early stage VC firm and also a fund of fund. So I'd like to kick off the questions with maybe Christian, with you. On the A16 side, I know you guys have done a lot of work for portfolios on the go-to-market side. What have you done on the AI agent side? Particularly, what sort of type of investments have you gotten involved in, and how are some of the ways that you've helped them?
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting question. We have a number of investments, in pure play crypto companies. I and my team help post investment, and this past year or so, we've seen a range of companies start to shift and materialize what this intersection of AI and crypto actually means. So we have investments in a range of companies. We recently invested in a company called Arc. They're building infrastructure for agent payments. Catena, AI native infrastructure for things like treasury management and identity. Jensen's a marketplace for compute and other things like that. So I think as we navigate what it means to go to market in a net new category, I always go back to this core idea of what's the use case, where's the actual demand. I think last cycle, and by cycle I mean blockchain development generally, we horizontally built infrastructure that in many ways got out ahead of what folks were asking for, and we found ourselves scrambling to bring the demand up to speed. And once they finally got up to speed, they weren't really buying the frontier tech. They were buying versions of the technology that we felt were generations earlier or iterations earlier. So I think with agent-based use cases, we have to ask ourselves who's actually asking for this. What is the transaction type? Does an agent-based version of this transaction type make more sense? And kind of think of it from first principles. And that's kind of what I've been doing in my day-to-day.
Yeah, and Abby, you mentioned a bit on intent, so maybe share with us a bit more on what you guys are doing with intents, and also from a general counsel sort of legal perspective, what are some of the things that, from a regulatory perspective, we should be aware about, and how to navigate sort of this.
Yeah, absolutely. First, a shameless plug, A16Z also invested in Near. So thanks for not mentioning that, Christian. But look, I think first question is, on intents. I mean, look, as I said, an intent is simply a desire for something to happen, right? And that could be to take Near and receive Bitcoin. It could be to buy headphones. It really, spans any type of, desire for something, right? Typically, the way people have, fulfilled these is, putting them into a search bar and then, figuring out how to do them, at least in the internet age. And we think, obviously, that is going to change and is changing before our very eyes. And so where we started with Near intents is in the cross-chain atomic swapping space, right? Because that, you've got sort of programmable assets. I want to change one to the other. And, I think that expands to not only a bunch of other transaction types, but to actually having agents that are operating that on your behalf. So you can think of a not so distant future where you're using your agent harness to allocate capital on your behalf to actively manage a strategy that you're providing input or research into. And that's the sort of layer that we're building on top of Near.com, which is our distribution layer for the intense technology, which includes, again, starting with cross-chain swaps, moving to other asset and transaction types, including tokenized equities and credit products, et cetera. So that's sort of what intents are. Now, how is AI involved? I think in a couple of different ways. One is, obviously, as I mentioned, to be able to allocate assets and to develop strategies themselves. Number two, to be able to transact more seamlessly across different blockchains. You need a sort of programmability layer between these different chains for an agent to seamlessly do this, right? Otherwise, the agent has to have 100 different accounts across 100 different chains to be able to, lose private keys across all of those is probably not a great management idea. I can tell you from experience, we've had some VCs who've actually lost their private keys, which is a pretty amusing thing to even hear about. So I think, don't want that to happen. You should probably have a transaction layer that is capable of signing across a bunch of different chains, and that in turn, makes it easier for agents. Again, we started with this, but I think the vision is broader for how agentic commerce broadly works. And I think a new sort of primitive that we're excited about, and I'll sort of tie into the second question, which is about legal issues, is an agentic marketplace, right? Because if you imagine now, we're not talking about, say, cross-chain transactions, but I don't know, I need to book this venue, right? And I need to find a vineyard in Long Island for these specific dates. Again, that process is super manual today. You reach out to a bunch of different vendors, you give them their, your specifications and do it this way. And again, the future that we see is specific agents that are sort of trained to be able to do these tasks better than others, and the ability to be connected to those agents very, very easily using any asset across any chain or cash for that matter. And so excited to be also building an agent marketplace primitive. You've seen some other ones like OKX's, for example. So I think these are going to become more common, and a ton of legal issues. For example, how do you deal with dispute resolution when you've got agents that are disputing whether I actually gave you the right venue? I said RGNY has nice wine, and Travis disagrees. He's a Bordeaux drinker and is very disappointed with the wine selection. So he's now upset with my agent. What the hell do I do? Well, the dispute resolution layer, and these are not unfamiliar problems. If you think about eBay, for example, the dispute resolution market, sort of technology that they built on their platform was a sort of like prototype for where this is headed. So that's only one problem. Then you've got, dispute resolution across multiple jurisdictions. You've got agent liability, right? So like how are agents insured, et cetera. So we'll talk about this more, but I think, broadly, these are issues that are going to take time to figure out, and people are going to experiment, and probably, we'll have some screw ups before we have, the kind of comprehensive, use of the technology that I think many of us are foreseeing in the coming years.
Okay, thanks for that. You might have used your time for the next question as well. But
Yeah, of course.
Travis, as an investor, what gets you excited about, or what makes projects or a founder particularly interesting to you today, and what type of metrics are you really tracking on the investment side?
Yeah, so I think that, if we take a step back and look at where we are and where we're going, right? I think that we are just at the very inception of the growth of an agentic economy. I mean, until 6 months ago, nobody was even really using AI agents. And today, there's almost nobody who's using an AI agent that's touching money or using money. But my belief, based on the trajectory of AI, is that in 5-10 years, we're going to have billions, maybe trillions of agents moving around hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars a year, right? So this is a mega trend that is coming. I think, some of this will happen on blockchain, some of it won't. But for us, the first and most important thing is that this is a massive macro trend. Now, when we look at investing, that doesn't mean that it's easy to know where to put your money today. There's a bunch of different categories. There's the financial infrastructure, there's identity and trust, there's orchestration, there's the interfaces, there's new markets emerging, there's a lot that you could invest in. And so, you have to ask first and foremost, where do you think value is going to accrue? Where do you think that new startups are going to be able to differentiate and develop a moat? And it's actually a particularly challenging question here because if the users are agents, they're going to behave differently than humans. And so you can't assume that companies are going to be able to develop moats in the same way that they were previously. So it's complicated, and I would say there's a lot more I could say on this, but there's one heuristic that I think is important investing today, which is we're looking for companies that are solving a problem that exists today. Because I think a lot of people see this future and they say, oh, we're going to need decentralized identity in 12 or 24 months, or we're going to need these sort of new markets for agents to buy things once you have agents doing all these other things. But the risk to me there is, you put money into these companies and there's just no way for them to go out and get traction and get the momentum that they need to get the real customer feedback that they need to, grow and iterate and eventually develop a moat. So, as we're looking for these companies, we're looking for ones that have identified something they can do today to solve a problem and generate revenue.
All right. And Johnny, actually during my time at Huobi, we actually invested in VeChain in 2017. So obviously it's very different than what it was back then. So maybe you can kind of overlay what sort of you guys are working on now, and at the foundation level, what opportunities you see in the market.
Yeah, happy to. So this has been a sort of long-term thesis internally that ostensibly we eventually see that the direct answer to the question here that's posed in the panel is that, whether it's 5 or 10 years or the next year, or I guess depending on how we were just having this debate earlier about how you define on-chain users, this is already probably this is a settled question. So it's probably less important. But more importantly, what we've been sort of a long-term thesis on has been that ultimately crypto is actually it's been used in a way that's not as efficient as it can be, right? It's intended to be used by machines. And so maybe roughly 2 years ago or so, we've been saying, hey, we started out with a platform known as vbetter.com, which is essentially a consumer-based application platform whereby we were iterating with various instances in which LLMs or using various different methods in which you can interact directly with an end user on vBetter as a way of sort of incubating different use cases that we think would eventually sort of blossom into more interesting green shoots. And to some of the things that you mentioned, right? Some of the things that we ran into were dispute resolutions. Like, how do you address that? Well, we were like, oh, well, we're going to throw escrow at that. Well, it turns out, like, how do you settle? How do like eventually agents at some point in time are going to look for potential type of places where they can potentially exploit, right? So like, and do you find yourself in this sort of long-term loophole where essentially a dispute is actually never resolved? And we're like, well, you know what? We've got marketplace orchestration experiences. So maybe what we can do is we can, above and beyond dispute resolutions via an escrow, what we'll also do is we'll structure it in a way where you just deposit tokens on hand, and if you decide to disagree that whatever product or sample of that product that's delivered to you is, say, not exactly what you're looking for, then you can step away, and then it's automatic. But then what do you do? How do you deal with liability? At this point in time, look, we may be somewhat 5 or 10 years, I guess, ahead of the curve, but we're very much downstream of all the things that I know our folks at NEAR are doing with Instance and the like. And so it's still very much, a TBD.
All right. And back to Christian here. I know
I would just add one quick thing.
Okay.
So terms like dispute resolution, my head always goes to resolution around what? I mean, what are the actual transactions that these agents are pushing forward? What use cases exist today or even in the next 5 years where it would make more sense for an agent to engage economically than a person? Maybe trading, maybe compute consumption, where the agent actually has to access compute dynamically. I think, it's important that we anchor ourselves in actual near-term use cases as we think about ways to bring these products to market.
Well, I mean, look, let's use a concrete example then, right? I mean, and it's sort of what you said, right? You don't want to build before they, build and they will come, or you got to identify concrete things that people want. So here's an example, right? Background searches, right? So right now, if you're running an OSINT background search, typically you, find a bunch of platforms. You go on Google, you go on, on X, you go on Instagram, you go and run the search, right? And there are services that do this. Now, one of the interesting things that we found was people wanted to run OSINT searches using, effectively agents that would orchestrate them. Now, what if that OSINT search doesn't capture something that you would reasonably expect a search to have captured, right? Say a racist post from 10 years ago that was quite offensive, and you would have not hired the person had you known. Or worse, the agent didn't actually do what it said. So it says it searched something and it didn't, right? I mean, so here's a more concrete example, right? I mean, because the sort of traditional examples, I think, whether it's access to compute or or sort of research or whatever, are like this is a way of sort of grounding that discussion in I think what is a concrete potential dispute, right? And then all the issues that Johnny just mentioned, come to play. Are you going to resolve it through escrow? Or are you going to resolve it through, it has to be a combination of on and off chain, because unless both parties agree to deposit some amount in escrow pending some off chain resolution, right? So, just sort of, would love to hear your kind of take on this.
I think it's interesting. I think OS in searches, also, removing data that's been compiled on you from data markets is also another use case potentially. But what you're describing is dispute resolution with the permissioning layer, the company that permissioned the agents. And I think that's an open question that we're still thinking through. How do you ensure that the agent is executing based on your intent, based on the constraints you put in place? These are all questions that I think the teams that I see day to day as they bring these products to market are wrestling with. But right now, there largely is either a company or an individual that is permissioning the agent to conduct something autonomously, more efficiently, more effectively on their behalf. But it does, it manifests itself perhaps, at least today, as an extension of something they would do themselves, just less efficiently. So to me, those things, you still have that counterparty in place. I'm most excited about what happens when we kind of get past this permissioning challenge and you have true autonomy. I just don't think the use cases are in market just yet to get there.
All right. We only have a couple minutes left, but maybe for all of you, what is like a contrarian take that you guys have, and like what would you say is potentially like the biggest bottleneck for AI agents ultimately becoming the largest users on chain? Anyone want to?
I'm happy to kick off quickly. I think, my experience building in this space for 10 years and just seeing a lot of companies try to articulate the value prop of why something has to happen on-chain versus off-chain. I think a challenge that I'm seeing, the payment infrastructure here in the United States is very, very good, very strong. The challenge I think we're going to face here is creating a business case for why agentic activity needs to happen on chain, and kind of there is a clear path for that. I think nano payments, micro payments, these kinds of things, but the use cases around which you'd actually need to make these small incremental charges need to kind of be built out and presented in a way that consumers and users and businesses can use. So right now, I think we are probably ahead of the curve when it comes to building the infrastructure for this technology. But in terms of the interface layer, how people can use this technology, how businesses can use this technology, I think is still an area that, at least in my view, leading companies are still trying to figure out how they can fit this into their existing business models, systems, and processes.
It's funny. It's effectively the exact contrarian take I provided someone else when asked recently, and it's like Swift is fairly well understood, and can be used. You've got ACH. You've got pretty good banking rails in the U.S., and you've got players like Visa who are just effectively building building on top of those, or with X402, for example. So they're kind of going in both directions, but it's unclear to me today, without the sort of micro and nano payment use cases, why you would always want to use the on-chain versus the off-chain element. Now, I think we're starting to see some of that. So the example I gave these guys was the Cloudflare API for media access. So if you're like a content creator and agents are using your content, how do you get paid for it, right? And and if that's surfaced through an API, like a access search API, your agent is going finding this content. That seems to me to be the kind of use case where this makes a hell of a lot more sense for having on-chain payments, whether it's through something like a X402 standard, or it's through through any kind of scalable protocol like Near, to be able to do that. But I think that's not always the case elsewhere, right? And lots of the places in the world don't have very good banking rail infrastructure, and so it may actually proliferate more, despite the U.S.'s advantage in this technology now, in places where that is not actually the case. So, just to sort of build on what you said, Christian, which I agree with.
I think it also goes well beyond just the use case of payments, right? So I mean, there's additional components of the service economy that folks in other places who don't have necessarily access to good education. So you find yourself being an algebra tutor, which we've so as of recent, we had a tutor who launched an agent on vworld.ai. Right, and this is an individual who hosts. So like the evolution of it has gone the following, right? I'm a teacher. I teach in person. I then moved to do it using Zoom or some sort of teleconference as a way of then growing my use case. Now I can actually effectively codify that in an agent, right? And have my the surface area of the potential consumer of that end product now has exceeded just the reach of my physical limitations. So I do think that ultimately, above and beyond sort of payments or financial use cases, that ultimately I think there's a larger service economy that is going to be more of a increase the pie.
Don't tell that to lawyers. They're professional services.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'm not GC, so.
Yeah, to go with that, I think ultimately the growth of the agentic economy and agentic finance, on-chain or off, goes hand in hand with AI's automation of knowledge work. I think that, as you have agents doing jobs, part of many jobs is paying for things. And also these agents are going to need to access new types of data and services that humans don't need. So I think, you're going to have to follow the trend line of what's happening in AI more broadly to really sort of predict out what happens here.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.